All right. Hello and welcome to this episode where we're going to talk about, is OCD and anxiety a lifelong condition, or the idea of can you recover, right? And so I want to start off by addressing this question because I think it's an important question, because when someone's seeking help for OCD and anxiety related problems, right, whether it's panic attacks or general anxiety, social anxiety, phobias, right, I always start with the idea that recovery is possible, right? Now, I want to go ahead and explain a little bit about what I mean by that. If we look at the feeling of anxiety as the problem, we are going to always have a problem, right? And this is the paradox, right, that I want to talk about of recovery, because anxiety disorders, by their very nature, right? You listen to, someone said, well, you have an anxiety disorder, or you get diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. What does that imply, right? That the presence of anxiety is correlated to the disorder. And while that's true, it's also not true, right? Because anxiety is a normal feeling. Anxiety is the stress response, right? It's a form of psychological stress. Your brain is producing a futuristic outcome that you don't want, and your body's reacting to it, right, to try to protect you from it, right? The problem is because it's not happening right now, there's nothing to really do. Hence, we feel this surge of energy that we call anxiety, right? Anxiety is just the stress response. It's the fight or flight response, but it's happening in a time when there's nothing to fight or flee from, right? So we have this surge of energy kind of meet the surface, and it feels very uncomfortable. If we were actually in a dangerous situation, that same energy we would use to propel us into motion or to fight, right? And because that surge of energy is there, it's really uncomfortable. And that's, what we commonly call anxiety in the States and, in more the Western part of the world. The thing is that anxiety is normal. Every time I've ever done a talk on anxiety, one of the first things I ask is like, hey, how many people have felt anxiety before? Every time everyone raises their hand. I've never had like someone just standing there like, no, don't know what that is. No, I've always lived in absolute bliss my entire life. Because that just is not, it's a normal human experience. Anxiety is a normal human experience. And we got to get to that point where we understand that, because if we judge the presence of an uncomfortable feeling as a bad thing, well, then what are we going to do? We're going to try to get rid of that. And the paradox of anxiety treatment is that we don't try to get rid of anxiety, right? That's what exposure and response prevention is, right? We move towards anxiety, right? We, in many ways, normalize the experience of anxious thoughts, of anxious feelings, right? And we learn to trust our body's ability to meet them and address them and process them, right, in a healthy, correct way. What actually happens with anxiety is a complete paradox. Is we have these feelings we don't like, we try to get rid of them, right, doing a variety of behaviors. So it could be things like avoidance, reassurance, checking, controlling, different types of addiction, right, that we try to neutralize our feelings, right, like, so I need to feel better, right? And the problem is that when we try to get rid of them, we suppress them, right? And we don't let the process happen naturally. And then therefore the feelings come back up to the surface more and more, oftentimes in a heavier way, right? And you often use the metaphor of like pushing a beach ball underwater, right? And what happens? Well, that beach ball comes back up to the surface, right? Every time. And in many ways, that energy that we experience, when we suppress it and we do things to mask it, right? That's why, using chemicals to suppress anxiety, right? Like people, will often, talk about marijuana or weed being something to help with anxiety. And like, as someone who works with anxiety, people with anxiety, like all day, every day, it's like, oh my goodness, it's like I couldn't think further from that, right? I couldn't be on the more polar end of that statement, because when you mask the feeling of anxiety with a chemical, especially like marijuana or your alcohol, right, and you just make it go away temporarily, it comes right back to the surface, right? And so our ability to normalize the feeling of anxiety is a huge part of our recovery from it. So when you say like, is this a chronic condition? Well, is the experience of anxiety something you're going to experience throughout your life? Yes. We will not have, we don't aim for someone to only feel happiness, right? Like that, the question in many ways sets you up for failure. Like, when it's like, can I get rid of this? Right. And that's why it's really about, when someone asks this question to me, it's really about getting the question clear. Because, like Tony Robbins famously says, right, the quality of our life is determined by the quality of the questions we ask. Well, if we want to never feel anxiety again, we're setting ourselves up for failure, right? But when we look at anxiety disorders, not as a problem of anxiety, but as a loop that someone gets caught in, where they're having thoughts or feelings that, are uncomfortable to them, and they're doing things to get rid of them, which is creating temporary relief, but ultimately keeps them trapped in this loop, right? And if we look at the problem of anxiety as a loop that we need to break out of, then yes, like I absolutely believe in recovery. I've watched people totally transform their lives around, and not only myself too, where I was totally lost in a world of OCD and anxiety when I was, in my late teens and early 20s. And yeah, like I used to ask those same questions, like, is recovery possible, right? Can I get better? Yes, absolutely, right? Like, let me just blanketly say that. Yes, absolutely. But part of that comes with the idea of what we're actually looking to change. When we try to change anxiety, the problem is we're focusing on the wrong problem, right? Because anxiety is a normal experience. So when we try to change anxiety, what happens is it keeps us in that loop, right? That's one of the behaviors we do. When we learn to eliminate the behaviors and actually trust our body's ability to ride through anxiety, right? And to ride through fear, and realize that that's a normal feeling for us to feel, and that it's not a disorder to feel the presence of anxiety, the way we look at recovery changes, right? And that's why I wanted to make this episode on this, because it's a question that I get often, where it's like, the idea of recovery and what that means. And once we have that common ground of understanding what recovery really means, that's when we can achieve it. But when we're working towards two different things, that's when people often get stuck, and there's a lot of butting heads, so to speak. So I think that in many ways our society's done a poor job of identifying the problem, right? Because, and that's part of what we do at Restored Minds, right? Is really about education. Like that has to be the first step of recovery, right? Of really educating what is the problem, right? Because if we see, someone experiencing anxiety, right? And let's say, a prototypical case of someone who's afraid of, contamination, and they're washing their hands. Well, if we see that because they're anxious and when they wash their hands, it makes them feel better, yes, that does happen in the short term. And many of the things people do operate from that short term, perspective of, I need to feel better today. But what happens is the more and more we try to feel better today, the smaller and smaller our life gets over the long term. So when we can shift our perspective to focusing on our long-term health, our long-term mental health, as opposed to our short-term, that is actually what allows recovery. Again, I know it's very backwards, right? Like this treatment is so backwards on every level, right? The more and more you try not to feel anxiety, the more you're going to feel it. The more you try not to think about something, the more you're going to think about it. The more and more you are willing to feel anxiety, the less and less that you actually feel it, right? Because when it surfaces, you don't see it as a bad thing, so you allow yourself to process it, and it happens very naturally. And recovery is really about building skill sets, right? It's not about managing anxiety or coping with anxiety for the rest of your life. It's learning to trust your body and learning that you can sit with that feeling, that the feeling is temporary, and your body has the ability to process it, right? Like these are fundamental shifts of how we look at anxiety, right? Or OCD or panic attacks, whatever. If we choose to see them as a bad thing, we'll always try to get rid of them, which will then perpetuate them, right? I think it was Carl Jung that famously said, like, what you resist persists. If you resist these feelings, they're going to persist. Like that's the whole paradox, right? And when we talk about recovery, it's not about the absence of uncomfortable thoughts or uncomfortable feelings. What it is about learning that the behaviors you're doing to make yourself feel better in the short term are going to impact you in the long term in a negative way. So choosing our long-term mental health and being willing to sit with discomfort temporarily is really the key to recovery and the key to success in many ways. Now, sure, there's lots of details and lots of tools and, cognitive behavioral techniques as well as exposures, and things like that we take people through, right, at Restored Minds. But that overall concept of recovery, it's like, yes, absolutely, I want to emphasize that I believe recovery is possible. If it's possible for one person, it's possible for anyone. And I really believe that when it comes to dealing with issues of anxiety. So if you're dealing with something like OCD, social anxiety, panic attacks, general anxiety or phobias, I absolutely believe in recovery. But I need to clarify what that means, right? It's not the absence of anxiety that we're trying to achieve. It's to get you out of that loop that you're in. And once you get out of the loop, what happens is your stress response stops firing. So you're able to live, yes, with less anxiety, right? And it's not firing off all the time, but we're not trying to achieve that by getting rid of anxiety, right? And that's the paradox of recovery right there, is the more and more you're willing to embrace it, the more and more your body regulates, right? And so, anyways, I just wanted to share those thoughts on this episode today because it's a question that I get a lot, and I wanted to, really make this episode to help clarify that. And if this is something you're struggling with, again, over at Restored Minds, we have lots of resources available for you, from support groups to, our Zooms, our coaching calls, as well as our Taking Back Control program, which is really where you're going to learn the skill sets you need to really start breaking out of those loops. And we also have some free resources as well. We have a free meditation right down in the notes beneath this. You can get some links where you'll get access to that as well. So if you found this helpful, we'd really appreciate if you take the time to like and subscribe, as well as share and comment, and let us know, ideas for future episodes. And again, check out the resources in the notes if this is something you're struggling with, because I think they'll really help you. And so thank you for taking the time to be with us today, and hope you guys have a great week, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you found it helpful, chances are someone else will too, and we'd really appreciate your support by liking and subscribing, and also sharing this video on your social platforms. Also, if you're looking for additional help, we have some resources right down in the links below to help you on your journey. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you soon.